Ever since I posted the original Why Pot of Greed is Banned video, as well as the follow-up video, Commenters Don't Understand Pot of Greed, I have to sift through literally hundreds of comments every month from people that are trying to quote-unquote fix Pot of Greed to make it playable in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In today's video, I want to quickly address some of the common suggestions that people said and sort of talk about why they don't quite work, but more importantly, I will spend the vast majority of today's video talking about the different ways that Konami has made Pot of Greed successful and how they tried to fix its effect. I'm not only going to be focusing on the pot spell cards, I've already made an entire video about those. I'm mostly going to be focusing on other cards that Konami has printed that say draw 2 cards, especially the ones that are spell cards, and see how Konami added certain restrictions to them to make them a little bit more fair and balanced than the original Pot of Greed. First things first though, I want to put at the very beginning of this video, as early as humanly possible, some of the most common bad suggestions for how to fix Pot of Greed. I know that even though I'm going to put these at the beginning of this video, I will probably still get comments with these exact suggestions, but overall these are the most common suggestions that I see that don't really make sense. The biggest problem when people suggest to fix Pot of Greed is that they are only looking at their new card in relation to Pot of Greed and not relation to other cards. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because if you take Pot of Greed and say, well, drawing 2 cards is too good, I'll just cut its effect in half, well then you get a better version of Upstart Goblin, a card that was commonly played as a 3 of in virtually every single competitive player's deck and is currently limited on the Forbidden and Limited list. So I think when you're trying to come up with new ways for Pot of Greed to be in the game, you really have to be looking at adding on costs and restrictions to that draw 2 effect, not just making it a draw 1 effect. Another common suggestion from people that usually haven't played a ton of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Or spent a lot of time talking about competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Is, well, what if you just added a life point requirement to Pot of Greed? What if you just had to pay 4,000 life points or half your life points no matter how many life points you're at? And the fact of the matter is that I could spend an entire video telling you why life points don't matter. Maybe I will someday, but for this video, all you have to know is that for most cases, card advantage is what matters a lot more than life points. Life points are almost never considered in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! When looking at the cost of a card. Solemn Strike isn't a bad card because you have to pay 1,500 life points, and in most cases, people don't even pay attention to that part. Solemn Strike is played because it negates a card. We can look at a one-to-one example. Would you play Solemn Strike or would you play Divine Wrath? And the answer 99% of the time, even if your deck has graveyard effects that would trigger off a Divine Wrath, is that people end up playing Solemn Strike because life points are always an easier cost to pay than cards in your hand or field. It's also worth noting that not every single +1 spell card is a Pot of Greed successor. I'm mentioning this because I'm sure people will comment things like, oh, Skystriker Engage is a +1 and that's at 3 copies, and that's totally fair. And I don't think a lot of people actually really think that, but I will address it quickly here. Skystriker Engage and similar archetype cards that are +1s but don't actually draw 2, in the case of Skystriker Engage, you are getting 1 draw and 1 search, aren't quite what I'm talking about in today's video, because Pot of Greed is good because it can draw unsearchable cards. In the case of Engage, it is obviously a very powerful card and a card that probably will end up on the Forbidden and Limited list eventually, but for now we're only talking about cards that draw 2 because you could play those in a similar way that you're playing Pot of Greed, and that's to draw cards that you can't necessarily search, because in 2 or 3 years, Skystrikers probably will not be in the metagame anymore, but Pot of Greed will be played in virtually every single deck, so we're going to look at the most generic cards out there, although obviously in a lot of these cases, the way that Konami balanced the draw 2 effect is by making it a little bit more specific, although usually not to archetypes, and we'll talk about that in today's video. What Konami has done with many Pot of Greed successors is only added 1 restriction or 1 change to Pot of Greed and then printed it as a new card. These cards also tend to be the most competitive out of the ones that we're going to talk about, so let's first start off with Pot of Avarice. Now this card was incredibly good eventually, but when it first came out, it wasn't played in a whole bunch of strategies. This is at a time when there were no Synchro monsters or Xyz monsters or Pendulums or Links, and it was a lot harder to get 5 monsters in your graveyard, especially on the first turn, so many people did not play Pot of Avarice in their deck, although Pot of Avarice eventually got a little bit more broken when we got Synchro monsters, and by the time that Pot of Avarice was banned, which was when Xyz monsters were out, there were simply way too many ways to put that many monsters in your graveyard on the very first turn, and the card was simply deemed too powerful. Now it is worth mentioning that even though this card is banned in the TCG format, this card is currently unlimited in the OCG format, which is pretty crazy to think about. This has actually come up a few times over the past couple weeks now. It seems like OCG players just historically do not care about draw power as much as TCG players do. Maybe that is worth a discussion for another time, but that is why cards cards like Chicken Game and Upstart Goblin and Pot of Avarice are completely unrestricted over there, but in the TCG, if those cards were completely off the ban list, most people would probably try to find a way to fit them into their combo decks. A more recent take of Pot of Avarice is Pot of Desires, and I love Pot of Desires from an argument standpoint. I think it's one of the most well-designed cards of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! It is a card that, yes, is played in a variety of strategies and has been very expensive at certain times, but I think what makes Desires so cool is that it's so polarizing. No one can really agree whether or not the card is good or not, and I think that one of the cool things about Desires is that it doesn't belong in every single deck, unlike a card like Pot of Greed and sort of unlike a card like Pot of Avarice. Pot of Desires is a well-designed card that does not automatically go in every single strategy, and it is a very balanced version of Pot of Greed. In the case of Desires, unlike Avarice though, I think what Konami has done is made the cost of it something that is future-proof. We talked about future-proofing in a few videos ago, but I think that's very important, and in the case of Desires, more so than Avarice, it seems like no matter how long Yu-Gi-Oh! Goes on, there probably still won't be a ton of cards that interact with banished face-down cards, which means the drawback of Desires will pretty much always remain a drawback. Another thing that Konami likes to do when they're just changing Pot of Greed in one single way is that one way that they change the card is by making you get rid of another card in the process. We see this on cards like Trade-In and cards like Consonus and Allure of Darkness and Destiny Draw, and these cards, even with that one card disadvantage, which by the way actually does make a big difference, because when you're looking at Pot of Greed, it's a +1 in card advantage, but when you're looking at those cards, they are just a 2 for 2, which is a net 0. This is a big difference, but in a lot of those cases, you are triggering graveyard effects, you're setting up other combos, and that's what allows those cards to be competitive. It's worth noting though that Konami at some point changed their mind on that particular piece of card design, and when they printed new cards like that, they also added other restrictions that made them a little bit more unplayable. Things like cards for Black Feathers and cards from the sky are almost the same thing as those cards, but they add on further restrictions, most notably that you can't special summon the turn that you use them, and that makes them a lot worse, and that's why those cards for the most part haven't seen competitive play, even with the decks that they're supposed to go in were competitive strategies. Sometimes though, when they make more than one change to something, if the changes that they're making actually help the strategy out, then ends up being a very good thing. For example, in Light Sworns, the extra drawbacks, quote-unquote, of Solar Recharge end up being upsides. Discarding a Light Sworn sets up your Judgment Dragon. Milling cards sets up your Judgment Dragon. All these sort of bonus drawbacks of the Solar Recharge end up being bonus effects, which is really cool for someone playing those old-school Light Sworn strategies, and also you get 2 free draws as well. This is an example of something along the lines of Pot of Avarice, when in the right strategy, the quote-unquote drawbacks of the card that Konami adds to it to make it not as good as Pot of Greed end up being pretty good in the long run, depending on what strategy or deck that you play the card in. However, Konami sometimes overtunes archetype draw spells a little bit too much, and then they end up having to hit them on the ban list. An excellent example of this is Pantheism of the Monarchs, a card that is very similar to things like Trade-In and cards of Consonance, except you also have a graveyard effect that gets you a free search, and that makes Pantheism a +1 overall. You see, the ways that many of the cards of Consonance and Trade-In cards are balanced is by making them 2 for 2s, but in the case of Pantheism, when you're playing a Monarch deck, you get the 2 draws, so it's a 2 for 2 right off the bat, but then you get an extra search in addition to that. This is a little bit different than Skystriker Engage, because that card gets a +1, where one of the pluses is a search for the archetype, but in the case of Pantheism, you get the draw 2, like many of the other cards we've talked about, but then also you get an archetype search in addition to that draw 2 Pot of Greed type effect. It's worth mentioning that just because a card says draw 2 on it doesn't automatically make it good. Precious Cards from Beyond and Supercharge are pretty bad cards that have never seen competitive play, and yet they are cards that draw 2. Drawing is extremely powerful in Yu-Gi-Oh! There aren't a ton of cards that actually do that, but just because a card draws cards doesn't necessarily mean that it's automatically broken or automatically competitive. You have to look at the entire deck that it goes around. In the case of Supercharge, it's a card that only works with Roids, which is not a very competitive strategy, and in the case of Precious Cards from Beyond, it's a card that only triggers when you already have a board set up and you can tribute summon a monster. It's just not consistent enough. Draw spells usually work the best when they're starter cards, not cards that you do halfway through the combo. This idea of draw spells being better when they're your starter cards and not your extender cards is the same reason that Trade-In sees play and Advanced Draw doesn't. Both of them on paper might look very similar to a lot of players, but the very fact that you do not have to go through hoops to summon a monster before you activate Trade-In makes it leagues better than Advanced Draw, a card that really hasn't seen a ton of competitive play, versus Trade-In that has seen a ton of competitive play in so many formats across Yu-Gi-Oh's history. So after looking at all of these ways that Konami has balanced the Draw 2 effect of Pot of Greed, hopefully what you learned was that Pot of Greed can't come back into modern Yu-Gi-Oh! I know a lot of people that played old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Think the card should come back, but I really hope Konami realizes, and I think that they do realize, that they can't bring a card like that back. They have worked for years to make more balanced versions of the card, and it seems silly to just bring back such a generically powerful card into the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! When all of these other perfectly balanced options exist, as long as you're willing to work a little bit for that Draw 2 effect that everyone knows and loves. Anyway though, I will see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's discussion video about Pot of Greed and how Konami has tried to fix it over the last 20 years. Goodbye.